Hey, folks, welcome to a live edition of the Security Table. This is Chris Romeo, and I am joined by my normal cast of characters, and we have a guest. But Matt Coles is here, and the man who only needs a first name on virtual platforms. He doesn't actually need a last name. He's like Prince. He's like the Prince of
He usually goes by it.
he usually does answer by to IT or any other number of names. But yeah, so we're super excited to have Patrick Garrity with us today. Patrick, our audience
Perfect.
probably doesn't, some of them probably know you, but give just a brief background about who you are and kind of what you do.
Yeah, so I'm hanging out. This is my office, turned it into a skate shop. I've been in cybersecurity for better part of the last decade. Started my career transitioning out of managed service provider. So lots of hands-on experience in IT. And then went and helped build Duo Security on the sales engineering side, go to market side, moved to Europe. And then we got acquired by Cisco. Spent some time helping Census spin out of University of Michigan, helping do discovery, and then worked on a company that called Blue Mirror that does detection and response in the SIM space for small medium sized business. And then more recently, about 2 years ago, I got into the vulnerability management space by joining Nucleus Security, and combination of help with anything and everything, but more recently over the last year spent a lot of time in the security research side of things, which led me to some of the work on doing data visualizations with vuln data.
And that's what we were admiring before we clicked the button to go live here. Your that multicolored picture that's kind of sitting over your shoulder right above there. What is so very quickly, just tell us what that is.
Yeah, so this is the CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency's known exploited vulnerabilities list. So at Black Hat, it was right around 1,000 vulnerabilities, and I just wanted to drive awareness that like everything is vulnerable. And so I spent some time doing tree maps and then did some overlays to create a data viz that kind of shows like, regardless of what company you are, the products in your environment are vulnerable. And so this kind of shows Microsoft and Oracle and Cisco and Apache and you name it, pretty much every company has vulnerable products. And I think that's a really important narrative, especially when we're talking to like executives or stakeholders that don't understand security. When we're talking about vulnerability management, right? So that was a big part of why I intended to do the work, and it kind of took off. So it was cool.
Very cool. Yeah. So, topic we wanted to explore today is CVSS, specifically the 4.0, the new version of CVSS. But I think it'd be beneficial to lay a foundation first before we dive into like what are the differences, what is 4.0 doing for us. Let's not assume that everybody who's watching, listening knows what CVSS is or how it applies to their world. So, Matt, why don't you set that up for us, since I know you've done a little bit of thinking about CVSS.
Yeah, I've I've been involved with CVSS for a while, as a user as well as a member of the SIG. So CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, is a production of FIRST, the Forum for Incident Response Teams. Incident Response and Security Teams. So FIRST.org. The SIG put together now a total of 4 versions of, well, more than that, but certainly 4 that are in popular use. Fun morning this morning. So CVSS 2.1, which many are probably familiar with if they've seen anything in the National Vulnerability Database from earlier years, and then 3.0, 3.1, which is the most recent in-release version, in-use version of CVSS, and then more recently 4.0 that launched in beginning of November of this year. So basically, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, for those who aren't familiar, is a method for determining the likelihood of exploitation and the relative impact of exploitation, looking at severity, not risk. So very, very important. If you take any given issue, any given vulnerability, and you try to, and we're talking specifically vulnerabilities here, not weaknesses, but vulnerabilities, looking at what's its severity relative to other vulnerabilities. You can use the CVSS calculator to generate a score from basically 0.0 to 10.0, where obviously 10 is critical, 0 is not, and then everything in between, low, medium, high, critical on the scale. And it's now the de facto standard or the current standard that's in use for the National Vulnerability Database. Many of the security scanners, vulnerability scanners will reflect CVSS scores, SAST and other tools as well. And so it's a generally recognized method for determining severity of vulnerabilities.
Okay. So how good is it? I guess is where I want to start. let's just not spend any more time in the kind of the warm up of the conversation.
Yeah.
Let's just
So
dive into.
let's be
Hey,
careful.
I think Matt is biased. Can I take this question?
Yeah, no, Patrick, I want to hear I want to get your take first on.
Yeah,
where do you wanna
and
go?
you're gonna find like most of what I'm critical about is not actually like CVSS. It's the aspect of how it's been adopted.
Yes.
And
Not biased at all here.
yeah, and to be honest, like the end users are highly impacted by this because the reality is like it shouldn't be them on them to fix this problem. And so I think we'll talk about what's so important with V4, but the biggest problem and challenge is that CVSS, predominantly the base score, is used in almost every vulnerability management tool. And every time you see a publication saying there's a criticality of 9.8 or 10 or 9.9, right? That's not taking into consideration any additional intelligence as it relates to threat. And CVSS has the capability to be enriched. However, and NVD, the score there is the base score, and that populates almost every vulnerability management tool in the world. So when we look at CVSS, everyone has standardized on the base score, which I think 56% of things are critical or high with that. So I don't know. That's my fundamental criticism, is the fact that like it's very promising, but I think and we'll talk about V4. I think there's some great things there, but unfortunately, very, very few vulnerability management programs, when they use it, enrich it with context of asset and threat. So fundamentally, that results in a pretty negative experience when you use CVSS for vuln prioritization, right?
So can we just make sure that users are familiar, folks who are listening are familiar with. So when Patrick was talking about base score, so CVSS has a collection of metrics. So in 3.1, there's a collection of metrics, base, which are the core of likelihood and likelihood or ability of an attacker to exploit and impact. And then there are extended metrics around environmental and temporal, which can be used to modify the score and get some, use that additional intelligence basically, or from a consumer standpoint to tailor the result based on their usage and their their environment. That's how it's intended to be used. It isn't always used that way, as Patrick highlighted.
Very, very rarely.
Very
I think
rarely
it's used that.
Yep. And
because it's hard.
Well,
It
okay,
is.
there's a challenge there, right? So in V4, we do try to fix that. Before we jump into V4, so there's definitely some challenges there, and the SIG took in that input and tried to do a better job with V4, and hopefully we got a baby step farther along.
So somebody give me an example. Like, how would CVSS be used? Before we go to V4, let's use V3, right? Because that's been the de facto standard for years, a couple of years, I think, if I remember correctly.
2019, 3.1 came in 2019.
Okay.
So
And then
3.0 was a little bit before that.
Okay. So 5 years basically it's been in play here. So Patrick, give me a use case here though. Like I want to make sure I'm understanding how CVSS is supposed to play how am I supposed to use it?
Yeah. So, well, I think that's an interesting question. So first, I think there's different ways in which you can use it, in that I've seen people use it. So most commonly, most widely adopted scoring system is adopting the base score. And frankly, like PCI DSS requires you to fix all things, I think, 4 or higher, which is basically fixing almost all your vulns anyway. So we all laugh at that. But in addition to the base score, right, and saying we're going to fix criticals and highs, everything 7 or above, that's mostly how people have operated or used it, or maybe prioritize things based on what scores are the highest. But the reality is like that's very difficult for most organizations to patch 60% of their vulnerabilities, right? I think most organizations end up patching somewhere around like 10, 15, 20% in a good case scenario. And then there's other approaches. So enrichment of the temporal and environmental metrics, which then, adjust your scoring accordingly and will prioritize things that have threat or environmental context that increase your risks. I see very few people adopting those things today. And I think like we'll talk about 4.0. I think there's some great shifts. And I think part of it's even a marketing problem and terminology problem, product terminology problem was some of it. And then the other way I've seen is people actually using the metrics themselves. So for instance, like you have attack vector, or you have, I'm spacing on the metrics. I should pull them up as I'm talking. But you can make informed decisions to say, oh, wow, this is exploitable via network. Like, you can remotely RCE this, for example, with, I think, 2 attributes. You can figure closely that out. So, Yahoo, for example, and this is public information, Chris Madden uses decision trees with stakeholder specific vulnerability categorization to incorporate threat. So something like Kev in a decision, and then further use the CVSS metrics themselves to say, oh, the attack vector is network. Oh, no privileges are required. Like that's a really higher probability. So it makes sense to decision on that. So those are kind of like 3 different ways I've seen in the wild CVSS being adopted as it relates to vulnerability management programs.
So
and that's on the
response teams.
Yeah, that's more on the internal vulnerability management teams. I think
Okay.
there's another side of this, which is like vulnerability disclosure, bug bounty / like software development, which I don't spend as much time on, right? That Matt or Azar might be more familiar with as far as some of the ways there and how it's used.
Oh, Azar, I'm not hearing you.
You're on mute.
Or you've lost audio. Now we can't
he's
hear
lost
you.
audio. Oh no.
Well, I mean, I have a magic button, so there's a button that just allows me to mute people completely.
This is the fun part of being live, right?
Oh
Yeah,
no. Oh no.
that. So
We
I
can't
can try to
hear you.
interpret what he's saying.
No,
No, we can't hear you.
no.
We can't hear you.
So
Check your audio settings. We'll come back to you on a bug
while we're
bounty
waiting for
question.
Izar, so one thing I do want to highlight, and this is sort of why NVD, we see NVD using only the base scores. Today in 3.1, the base score is intended to be used by vendors, people who have vulnerabilities and they get they get a CVE for it, for instance. The base score is intended to be used from a vendor standpoint. The temporal and environmental metrics are intended to be used by consumers of vulnerabilities and how that vulnerability will impact them, right? So for instance, if there's a library, then upstream provider provides a library, and that library has a vulnerability, you get a base score. But then when you consume it, you're then when you consume it, you're going to then modify its characteristics based on how you make use of that library or that component or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. I want to interact with, so we have the ability to look at comments that people are putting as we're having this conversation. And so I want to put up Dan Kuykendall's comment here because I want to have the panel kind of react to this. Like, it seems like like what Dan's suggesting is kind of in line with what Patrick, you were saying. I think you made this kind of similar statement, but Patrick, what's your reaction here? Do you think is Dan right on here in his assessment of how CVSS has been classically approached?
Yeah, so I think a few things, right? Which is, I think there needs to be more vendor responsibility of adopting CVSS enrichment. So the like truthfully, part of the challenge is that it has difficult for vendors to get customers to choose the metrics. So like I don't know that the customer should choose. I think like it should be auto enriched. Maybe the environmental metrics, there's some choice in that, but like that's where we need to get broad adoption of CVSS beyond base score is like the work has to be done for the consumer. And I know there's some work that they're going to have to put in, but like none of the vuln management tools out there do this for them today that I'm aware of that I've ever seen. Like all of them just incorporate a base score. There might be like a rare exception to that, but like the most popular tools, you don't really have the luxury of modifying even the CVSS scores. So that's a real thing that needs to be overcome in order for people to really get value out of CVSS with their vuln management programs. And it is something too, like even on our side, like we believe that V4 makes it much easier for the product companies that are delivering VM tools to do that, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah.
So in this case, Patrick, you're talking about using you're not talking about changing the way that CVSS works. You're talking about the implementation by tool vendors that should come with context.
Yes.
And we've talked about this, I think, on the security table in the past about the problem with many of these tools, SAST, bad word DAST tools, as Chris is known for, that and potentially or static code analysis at this point. Context is always a problem. And so, do the tools know what they're looking at? Would it be able to provide the right information, or at least give options to? I know that some tools will ask, like, what type of system are you building? And yay, yes, another DAS fan over here. Yeah, so it's interesting to see how that turns out, but it's nice to see that it's nice to know from a SIG standpoint. I think that CVSS has the capabilities. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, hey, there are some things I think too, like there is more OSINT, like there was an OSINT data regarding vulnerability threat intelligence very accessible until more recently. So I think the other things is it would nice to be even see like maybe upstream like NVD enrich CVSS scoring with a threat intelligence that's available, like SysACEV, known exploited vulnerabilities list, and EPSS would be another example. So I think there's some interesting things that could happen that would make it easier, because in some ways, like if CVSS did that work actually before it hit the vendors, that would even make it easier for it to get broader adoption. So generally speaking, like I love to be a voice, even myself, of trying to get vendors, not only us, to adopt open standards like CVSS, CVSS BT score, BTE, which we'll get into when we talk about EPSS, CAV. Like all these things are great for product companies to be implementing and putting in their products, and we're seeing a lot more adoption of that, which is great.
Well, and actually, sorry. Can I just
please respond.
Oh,
can you hear me now first?
Yeah.
Yes, Cesar's back.
Yes.
So this is probably a good segue into V4 because of some of the capabilities that were added in V4 that vendors can take advantage of, or vendors can use, that consumers can then leverage in their use. So to introduce it a bit, so CVSS V4 takes and expands the Isar, can you just mute for a sec? I think you have background noise.
I don't know if I can get back from it.
Yep, it's you. Well, maybe he'll come back. Maybe he won't. So it sounds like a fan. So in V4, the metrics have expanded. We've done some changes from 3.1 to address confusion, the way that things were being set in 3.1 that often resulted in misscoring or confusions about scores, especially when it came to things like how scope is handled. And we can talk at length about that if you want. But the key part I wanted to highlight, because what Patrick was mentioning, was supplemental metrics. So while supplemental metrics don't affect the score, it's additional data points that vendors can provide to their consumers so that they can interpret the results appropriately and make important decisions from it. So it was important to highlight that just because of the topic. We can dive into that in more detail as we go.
Yeah, I'd love to get Patrick's take on CVSS 4, kind of from that perspective, as far as what you've seen as you've kind of studied it and analyzed it.
Yeah, so I think like proceed with caution. I tell people, and the first reason why I say proceed with caution isn't because of any reason other than like it just came out. It's really not being used or leveraged. It's not in the NVD. So saying like suddenly we're going to do CVSS version 4 doesn't mean much. I think right now. And so there's a long tail of time, like almost like with any product coming to market, where like all these things need to be true to where it's going to be usable, at least for vulnerability management or product security teams, right? At the same time, like there's no rescoring of previous vulnerabilities. So if you standardize on version 4, you still have to leverage and use previous versions for older vulnerabilities. So, I think this is just the dynamic of like the reality of how CVSS has worked in consideration. That being said, like I think it's really promising if we're like going, okay, from now on moving forward, like maybe we consider leveraging and using CVSS version 4. But once again, like we need vendors to get on board with enrichment. Auto enrichment, I think, is huge. I think talking to some intelligence firms, the concept of enriching and creating a BT score is possible without having any asset information. So I think there's some really interesting and promising things that could be done. And I see an advisory. So, that's the first thing from my perspective. I do think that the change in the scoring methodology is going to provide better distribution. If you're only using a base score, based on my work of doing calculations, it looked like the scores will generally be as high or higher. But that being said, they'll be better distributed, which is a big bonus as well. So yeah, and that statement could be inaccurate. I did my work in like June. But my guess is like generally using the base score is probably going to feel the same as it did before. So you really, if you're going to adopt CVSS version 4, want to look to how you can, get to a threat and environmental side. And the last thing I'll just say in version 4 is, I think the marketing side, like in some ways what CVSS did in putting nomenclatures together, it's not as if the nomenclatures didn't really exist before, but this is an example of where marketing can really help. These nomenclatures break out the base score, which is called CVSS -B. Then you have the base and threat metric score, which is CVSS base plus threat metric. And then you have BTE and BE. So BTE would be your base score plus the threat enrichment plus the environmental metrics. And that would be the ultimate goal, and is pretty much a universal risk score. I might have said that wrong. Matt's like, yeah, maybe a little bit, but I think you're
less
getting
risk, more severity, right?
Yeah, but if you're getting into asset context with the environmental conditions, then I think like it does get much closer to risk. And so I just think like that's some of the promising aspects of, I think, CVSS version 4, depending on which vendors. And I think like Nucleus is an example, the company I work for, where since we're like an aggregator and looking at all of this, we have the opportunity to do that. Whereas like that's a lot harder to do on a scan tool, for instance, right? So I don't know. I'm pretty bullish, and Nucleus is pretty bullish as far as like the possibilities of CVSS version 4 and how it could be used and adopted within vuln management and product security programs.
Izar, you've been waiting so long to say something.
Yeah, can I get one in there?
Oh.
So I don't know if you guys discussed this already when I was off, but my thing with CVSS and going very much into what Patrick said about marketing is that there was sort of miscommunication somewhere in the way that people understand it and the way that people use it. And as you alluded before, people started adopting it as a show of risk. And CVSS very quickly for me became what I internally call the panic index. Oh, it's a 10, it's a 10, let's run around with our heads on fire, and yeah, it's a 10. And as you guys know way better than I at this point, it's not always the idea, right? But one big thing that was always there for the users, for serious users of CVSS, in my opinion, is that, yeah, you get a nice index out of it, but the index itself, it's not the whole story. The index has to be used together with the vector so that you can tell the story behind the index. And people very quick became very adept at interpreting the index, but not quite so at the vector. And what I'm afraid of now is that CVSS gets derived into CVSS B, BT, BTE, ETE, EBB, whatever we mix in there. And people are going to have an even worse time at understanding that. So, touching back into what you mentioned about marketing. Now that the standard is out, what is the SIG planning to do in order to make this thing easier for people to consume and perhaps fix the mistakes of the past?
Nobody wants that one.
Well,
Everybody's like,
you asked about
nope,
the SIG,
can't
and that's
deal with
the
it,
only one
sorry.
on the SIG.
Nerve.
So, all right, so let me try to unpack that a little bit. But
But I was so explicit.
You were. So I think first off, putting better. So one of the things that we tried to do in the SIG was to really focus on documentation. So the specification, the user's guide, there's an FAQ, there's examples to help people with scoring. And also, given that sorry, your background noise is really ramping up even.
I don't know what's happening here.
Like jet engine kind of background noise.
Hey Matt, on the training note, right?
Yeah,
that you're talking about. Like, I think last night or the night before, I went to first.org and I went through the V4 training.
Oh, good. How was it?
And yeah, I just want to emphasize, like, that's available to everyone.
Free.
It was good. It took like half an hour to an hour. It's a good overview for people that are in vulnerability management or want to become more familiar with CVSS. So yeah, kudos on that.
Thank you. That was really important. Obviously, training is hard. Documentation is necessary. One of the things I think you highlighted earlier was, that people are unfamiliar with certain aspects of how CVSS is intended to be used or could be used. I imagine a number of folks probably don't know that there's guidelines for vulnerability chaining. There's guidelines for different types of component usage and how that will affect your CVSS scores. And there's different and there's guidance or information in the user's guide and the examples for some of the we tried to get ahead of some of the new questions around things like so a couple of the big changes that happened in V4 from 3.1 was we changed how scope works, right? So scope originally was it either has or has not changed based on you have a vulnerable thing and then you have some impacted things, and scope change occurs when the vulnerability occurs in one component but affects a different component. But what wasn't clear was what did scope change really mean from those metrics. And so in V4 we split those out, so now you can have an impact against the vulnerable system and or the subsequent system, the impacted systems. And so you get better clarity. And so we took a lot of effort to make sure documentation was clear on those points. Likewise, many of the other aspects around how usage of the calculator and as to Izar's point about what the index or severity label means versus the score. And so you get better information, better data out of the calculator. Or when you generate the score, you get better data that's encoded in the vector string that can allow you to make better informed decisions. And that was a really big focus area for us. I also see there's something in the chat. Somebody was asking about, well, what about things like medical devices and whatnot? And so we, one of the nice things about V4 is that it has added metrics or metric values around functional safety. So safety of people, not just of systems. And so this was an attempt to start to introduce the human aspect to CVSS. So previously it was primarily around data and function, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. But now it can also include whether or not a vulnerability can impact, either directly or indirectly impact safety in a system. So if that system is being used as a medical device, or favorite example, nuclear power plant control, then those are kind of important to understand, that this vulnerability may not be serious, but it may have a safety impact, and therefore you want to take attention to it. So yeah.
Can I ask a question about the complexity of this thing?
Yes.
Oh
So
yeah,
is it
that's my gripe.
is
That'll be
it
fun.
is CVSS 4.0 calculator and the entire algorithm that's been created, is this for everybody first? Or is this just for people who are in the trenches deep enough where they can understand all these different things? Because I'm looking at the calculator and I got attack vector, complexity, requirements, privilege required, user record. I mean, I've got a lot of things that are
And
feeding into
your
this
eyes
thing.
are just glassed over, right? You're like a
But it's
deer in
but I
headlights.
gotta
No.
understand.
But
Who's it
wait, you
for,
asking
though?
about the calculator, or you asking about the algorithm behind the calculator?
Well, I mean, the calculator implements the algorithm. I hope.
Yes.
I hope it's
Yes,
something
but
different. Wait, yes, but what does that mean?
Yeah. What does that mean, Arizar?
okay, so on 3.1 and before, you had this nice formula. You change the levers, and the levers serve as flags for multipliers of weights that at the end give you the nice number. But now when you look behind the thing, you have, what was it called? The
Equivalency
the
sets.
equivalent the equivalency sets that point out to strings that have to be built dynamically, and then each group of strings points to a bucket, and that bucket represents something else. And it wasn't easy to go through all that stuff, I have to tell you.
But you
So
don't
that's back
have
to the
to.
complication of
So I
complicated
think
nature.
yeah, I think there's a few things to unravel here. Like 99% of the world will never understand how CVSS works, and they shouldn't have to, right?
Right.
But there's a fundamental disconnect between CVSS being a protocol that does this thing, right? Like, does everyone understand how email works and SMTP and all that stuff? No, but they use
We
it
do.
every day.
We do.
Right?
We do.
Yeah, you
We
all
do at
do,
least.
but yeah, but outside the circle. So I think there's this reality that it's like, well, the challenge, right, is there's only very few sophisticated, very mature organizations that can adopt CVSS at a level of scale. You have to have sophistication, right? And so I'm not saying everyone in the world is dumb, but it's just the reality that it's like, is this the most important thing for them to understand in their job role? Probably not for most. If you're in vuln management, like you probably should know some of it. But the reality is I meet a lot of vuln management and product security teams that know absolutely nothing about vulnerability scoring, right? And so that's where I think like I'm incredibly biased towards. There's a disconnect, and I think part of the marketing needs to be to vendors in interoperability, where they're adopting these standards and they're doing the work for the consumer. Like they're enriching threat intelligence of the CVSS score, so they don't have to know if they're using CVSSB or BT or BTE. But the reality is like, good luck trying to get Tenable or Qualys to do that, or any other. I'm not trying to criticize, but like you have hundreds of vendors out there that you have to go advocate to actually make this a possibility. And so I think that's like the biggest challenge that CVSS v4 is going to have, is the right adoption within the tools that are out there in these existing customer environments, because like they're going to keep on using the CVSS score that whatever the tool in their environment is spitting out. And that's the harsh reality.
So I want to come back to Matt here and ask this complication question, because I didn't get his answer on that. But like, is this too complicated, or is it okay because it's not for everybody?
Well, so I want to tackle the is this for everybody? CVSS should be used, in my opinion, in my personal and my professional opinion, that CVSS should be used by anybody who's scoring, who needs to know, wants to do an apples to apples comparison at the very least, or wants a consistent way of calculating the severity of an issue. Now, do they need to understand the math behind it? To Patrick's point, I think the answer is no, right? People rely on technologies all the time that they don't necessarily understand how it all works underneath. And that's okay because the calculator abstracts that for them, right? It's important to know what the metrics are, what they mean. So when we say attack vector, what does attack vector mean? What does it mean to be network versus adjacent, right? That's important to know. But that's important to know if you're creating vulnerabilities or working on vulnerabilities. That's important to know because that's how you would then specify mitigations or how you would look at risk or other things that should be part of your of a job function there. And so, is this for everyone? I think it's for everyone who has a usage for it, and whether or not it's using a easy to understand formula and by the way, the old CVSS formula I don't think was trivial to understand either. Uh, the use of equivalency sets doesn't make it worse. It is a bit more mathy. There's some more theory to it, but it gives more expressive uh, results, right? Which is the important part. So I think in that regard, I would say it is for everyone who has a need to use it.
Izar?
So here's the thing. First of all, clarification. I agree. 4.0 will bring us better results. With that said, I have to play the devil's advocate and say, are we creating a trust me bro effect here? Where I say, this is the CVSS result, and behind the curtain, how it got gotten to, it's not really a problem. Just trust us. We went through the math, and the math is good. And at the same time, we advocate for people to know as much as they can about the things that they run and the things that they own. So are we giving mixed messages in here? And what if
I
somebody, a vendor, comes in and says, you know what, I question the CVSS result that I got, and nobody can, a small number of people can actually go and say, okay, let's look at the math and see how you think that this thing broke.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you my perspective here, which isn't necessarily a common perspective. Well, I'll give you my perspective. I don't know what the rest of the SIG would say, but uh, you know, the the CVSS SIG is made up of, I don't know what, 50 different 50 plus individuals from organizations that range from individual people who do who do vulnerability management or vulnerability discovery for a living, all the way up to small, medium, and large organizations and governmental and non-governmental agencies. Some people have a heavy background in math and computer science. Others have, history and other and program management and program development experience, or they're vulnerability managers. So a whole range of experiences and understandings and perspectives. And this was, implemented, tested internally, beta tested with outside people who provided comments. We got comments from the industry about the scoring method, about the approach, about the calculator and all of its details and all the documentation. And over the course of the past X number of years, and so this has been well vetted, I would say, right? So it's important to highlight that this is a community effort, obviously initially of people who are members of FIRST, which are people who have a vested interest in understanding how vulnerabilities are scored and managed and acted upon, and then beta tested with the community at large, the people who will be consuming the results of the calculator and all the documentation, et cetera. And so over that period, we tried to address any of the comments that came in. And so is it perfect? Unlikely. Is it supportable? I believe it to be. And then time will tell if it becomes trustworthy.
Yeah, I
That's
think
how I,
one thing is too on that note. Like I research threat intelligence sources, EPSS, exploit prediction scoring system, CVSS. I will tell you, like I do think that people ideate a little bit too much on perfection. And it's really like when you have 240,000 vulnerabilities, it's really easy to pull out all the ones that are anomalies that are misscored or like should be higher, or like I can tell you every scoring system I've looked at. And like, hey, why does every threat intelligence source have completely different vulnerabilities on it? Open source and non-open source. And I think that's a bit of the reality of like the complexity and the state that we're in right now, too. And so I try and caution people, like every time someone shows up to the EPSS SIG, they point out that like there's 10 Kev vulnerabilities that have a very low score. And then it's explaining like, well, yeah, this is a machine learning model and this is how it works. And like, oh, by the way, like, just because something was exploited 10 years ago doesn't mean that it's going to be exploited in the next 30 days. So little bit different there, like, because we are talking about ambiguity with machine learning. And it's not logic, driven necessarily. But yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have in vulnerability management is like everyone is just like, where's the silver bullet? Where's the silver bullet? Where's the silver bullet? And reality is like there's a lot more work to be done, and people need to acknowledge like where to prioritize their efforts. And starting with a CVSS base score is probably one of the worst things you can do for a vulnerability management program. So,
as a consumer,
yes, as a consumer, sorry.
Right.
as a
So-
vendor, that's where you start.
Yeah, it's critical.
So thanks to both of you for the answers, but just to add a bit more fire on the pile, Patrick, you went to EPSS, and in there isn't even a semblance of trying to make the algorithm known. It's already known, hey, it's closed. No, you can't look behind the curtain, and you know what? Just accept the number, work off of it. And I don't know, something inside just tickles me that we are trying to get all this clarity and all this understanding and everybody to look at the same thing. It's not even a silver bullet. It's to look at the same thing the same way so that we can go after the important things before everything else. And at the same time, we are muddling the way that we get to that angle. So, while I agree with everything that both of you said, and yes, this is getting better than it was a year, 6 months, 3 months ago. And it's probably going to get better as we go forward. Something still doesn't fall right with this whole believe us thing.
Trust.
I would like to see more clarity.
Like vulnerability management has failed at this for decades, so that's why nobody has trust.
Yeah, so now we are failing in a different way. We're failing in a way of remember when to run a computer program, you had to go to people that wore white coats to closed labs, and you had to just ask them to please talk to the machine. The feeling now is that again we are putting an interpretation layer between the things we want to know and the people who are telling us what we need to know. And I think that with the whole everything is open approach, I probably got infected by that virus and something tickles me wrong. But I definitely see what you two are saying. So I'm not saying that it's inherently bad. I'm just saying that it's funny in this time and age, I guess.
Well, so what? Thank you for your perspective. What do you need to see? So, if we're looking at the future of, say CVSS, right? So we're looking at 5.0 in the future, right? What do you need to see out of it? What do you think is missing?
Okay.
Since
Let
you
me
opened
come
the door.
clear here.
You opened
No,
the door
let
right
me
away.
come clear. I have a degree in math. The only reason they gave it to me is if I don't use it ever. So I'm coming from that point, okay? The thing that I liked about CVSS 3.1 was that I could look at that line, at that equation, or set of equations, look at the weights, and start understanding immediately what was it that, why one thing is considered to be more important than another in building that final panic index, right? And on CVSS 4, it's very, to me at least, very difficult. It's not as clear as I think it should be. I think that the whole thing that I'm saying is it would be great, and perhaps there is, and I just don't know. It would be great if there was some documentation to the documentation that would explain better how those sets of things were gotten to and what they actually represent. And I understand that it was a collection of data from a lot of different sources, and somebody bucketized those things, and from there came the sets. But I think that it would be great if somebody took the time to take us by the hand and lead us through the whole process, just so that adoption can be a bit easier because people understand a bit better the things that we didn't understand about 3.1 and before. You see what I mean? It goes to that marketing piece that Patrick brought up. If we want this, and I want this, to be adopted, it has to be clear. And right now it's not. To me.
Fair enough.
I think it's. I do think to some extent I agree with you, but I think time will tell as we see how things are scored too. That was one of the things I recommended that I was a little bit disappointed in, and maybe I interpret this wrong, but I'm like, why don't we go and rescore the last 20,000 vulnerabilities, right, and see how this model works? And so I like. I'm not part of the SIG. I'm speaking on my behalf, but I'm like, logically, if I'm building a product, I want to see the outcome. And I do think there is a little bit of this, like, yeah, just trust us. Like, we believe it's the best math. And I think it's documented and clear, but also I think we're moving past a point of like logic in a lot of these algorithms or machine learning where there is no logic. Well, I don't, maybe the wrong word is no logic, but like you can't just say like, here's why the machine learning model told us why this vulnerability is the
There's
highest
no
rate.
explanation to the logic that perhaps exists. That's what I think you mean.
And so like when we're looking at artificial intelligence and machine learning and things like that, it like totally throws things out the door. What I can tell you from my research is what I did and what I suggest other people do is they should spend time intimately understanding what they're going to use to measure in their vulnerability management or product security programs. So like if you're going to use CVSS, you should probably spend a lot of time becoming familiar with it and how it works so that you know what impact that's going to have on your organization. Like then for me, I went to EPSS and I was like, let me learn everything about this. And like, why are these low scores? And I'm looking at threat intelligence and there's known exploitation. Well, you know, it took me a while to start looking at these different parts of the pie and realizing like each one of them has its own unique value. And the more you understand and use, probably the better your vulnerability management program is going to be. But like, that's a hard thing right now because none of these things are correlated. The data sets are out there and all over the place. And so I think, you know, to some extent, we're talking about like most OSINT, you know, vulnerability intelligence sources just came around in the last, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years. Kev 2 years this month, right? And EPSS maybe 3. So I think we're like really early on. And I do think like, you know, there's some interesting like creating scoring systems by different vendors and trying to obfuscate all this. I think you have like Qualys True Risk Score. Tenable has VPR, but the challenge is then we're moving to proprietary standards, and those don't scale across an enterprise across all the different tools.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think some of it's maturity, right?
Yeah. So Patrick, just to your point about rescoring, so we did. I mean, we certainly did within the SIG, and then I think during the beta process there was additional rescoring of select things from the members of the SIG or from you know that were publicly available vulnerabilities. The hard part, I think, that you know that needs to be recognized here is many of the old vulnerabilities that are in NBD don't have sufficient information to know all of the details. Like you're not you're at that point you're a consumer, not a vendor, and so you know you can't necessarily know all of the intricate aspects to be able to create the base score at the very least, right? So if So for instance, if the score said scope change yes, if you're looking at a 3.1 score originally in NVD, it's challenging to know whether the CINA impact was for the vulnerable system or the impacted system or some combination thereof, right? So that you can then create a proper V4 score with a vulnerable impact and a subsequent impact. And so those sort of challenges are and I see you're smiling. I know you probably were part of some
Well,
of
I
those
did.
conversations.
What I did in my research is I created ranges, right? So I had a high and a low range. So like the attributes that didn't map 1-to-1, I like literally determined like, well, this is the lowest score it could be and the highest score it could be, and then I baseline that across all vector strings for 3.1 and 3.0. And yeah, basically it showed it's like, you know, I have the visual somewhere, but like generally those plots were higher. But they were better distributed. So like not 10% of the vulnerabilities are scored as a 9.8.
That's a good thing.
Wait, that's bad. All right, so I want to interact. I know we've got a great audience that's been following along, both on LinkedIn and YouTube with us, and so I want to interact with some of the comments and questions that we've seen come through here. We've interacted with a few of them just because they were in the middle of the conversation, but let's take a look at this one from Buddy Bergman, who's asking a specific question in regards to using the vendor's enriched vulnerability severity. He's specifically calling out PCI's patching requirements for critical or high. Anybody have? Looks like Patrick has an opinion on this one. Patrick, what advice would you give Buddy here, though, is in regards to this issue?
I'm not a lawyer. Yeah, I mean, like here's the thing, right? Is like the way it's written, from my understanding, is you basically have to use the base score and patch 4 or higher for your PCI environments. What I thought would be promising, right, is maybe compliance standards could incorporate to say, hey, you can use the BT score, and that would then be sufficient. So I think there's some promising hope. Like, yeah, good luck lobbying PCI to change their standards, and oh, by the way, all the other new standards. And I do think that standards are becoming more important. Like just this month, we saw NYDFS also acknowledge vulnerability management and doing it based on risk prioritization. So maybe they would qualify BT or BTE score as a consideration for that requirement. And that's what is exciting to me about open standards and CVSS is like, yeah, if we can have compliance requirements that say, hey, we'll let you use the BTE score and do 7 or higher. Wow, that's going to make everyone's life a lot easier. So, you know, that would probably be my, you know, tying to PCI and all the other regulations coming down the pipe. Like they're too vague. Like do it based on risk scoring. Like do it based on Kev. At least Kev is a start, right? But I think there's just so much more than that from my perspective. And if we incorporate the nomenclatures into compliance, it could help out a ton.
Mm-hmm. Here's another one from Itamar. What are some open source initiatives vendors can partake in to help with enrichment? So back on that enrichment kind of topic here. Matt, is there anything that comes to mind from your perspective? I know you have a wide view of what's happening in this space.
Well, so
well, I don't know what the dog was just recommending something. I couldn't translate it though. Izar is normally our translator, but go ahead, Matt.
And so the remember the enrichment that Patrick was talking about was really having tools when they spit out scores to provide additional information or make use of that additional information to refine the scores that come out or the vectors that come out that get generated. And so open source initiatives, I guess, open source initiative vendors, meaning open source maintainers, can help with enrichment by when they build tools, allow users to provide or allow for the ability to detect conditions that can be used for context, right? So if you're maintaining OpenVAS or a similar open source tool like that, as a vulnerability scanner, maybe have the ability for a user to provide either at the CLI or as a configuration file information about the system that's being scanned so that you get better results, right? If you're using SemGrep I don't know, Flaw Finder or whatever, that can also likewise provide context so you get better scoring information, right? That the hard part with the TE portion, the non-base or beyond base metrics, is it comes down to how you're using a component or how you're using a system or an application, and that would allow you to modify the base score, right? So the base score will calculate, is the vulnerability going to be impacted over a network, and does it require authentication, or do you have to trick a user into doing something for user interaction, and does it affect confidential integrity and availability in one or more systems? The extended metrics, the threat environmental metrics, provide things like, well, do I care about confidentiality in my environment? A tool doesn't necessarily know that right off the bat, but a human does, or there's something that can be provided to provide that information, and that can give better score results. And that's how you should use the calculator as a consumer. And so, I guess the call to action here is whether you're an open source maintainer of a tool or even a commercial vendor of a tool, it'd be nice to have this information so you can get more realistic scores. And to Israel's point, not everything needs to be a 5.0 bright red color or sky is falling fix now, because when you can get better and more accurate outcomes.
So there's no room for Chicken Little in the world of CVSS.
The CVSS will let you do that if you want. I would argue your vulnerability management program, there shouldn't be room for that.
It's actually the other way around. Sorry, Patrick. I think that there's too much space for Chicken Little in the CVSS world, because if you misuse it, that's all you get. Sorry, Patrick, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the question on the open source stuff and contributions. I will say, if you have threat intelligence or exploitation data, I work on the EPSS SIG. We incorporate that in order to build a machine learning model. So if you have any of that type of information, we use actively nuclei, Metasploit. I think F5 contributes, Gray Noise, Fortinet, Cisco, a bunch of other vendors. So I don't know. I think that kind of hits on the question that was asked earlier regarding making contributions. And I will say the EPSS SIG for good or bad is pretty loose in regards to there's a lot of people in it. So it's a good place to hang out in regards to coordinating with different people as it relates to vulnerability management standards. So you can check that out.
So we're almost out of time, but I want to react to this kind of last comment that I just saw pop in here, and just see, do we agree with the statement that's been made here? CVSS is shared responsibility. Vendor provides a base score. Consumer adjusts with threat and environmental based on their specific use case. It's not solely one or the other. Do we agree with this statement as a way to kind of wrap up our CVSS conversation?
In a perfect world.
Generally, I agree, and our documentation, the documentation for CVSS supports this.
I think that I agree. I think there's a middle person, which is the tooling, and the tooling is actually the core to the problem of CVSS today, where the tooling is not taking any responsibility nor building the capabilities to support CVSS functionality. So that's where I think the shared responsibility is failing today that we're seeing. Hopefully we see that change with version 4.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're out of time here for today's security table. Thanks to everybody who joined in and contributed, commented, gave us opinions, asked questions. Thanks, Patrick, for joining us as a guest here. As always, Matt and Nizar, thanks for being around the security table. We will catch everybody next week.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Patrick. See you guys later.